Hello and welcome to Dateline, the programme which brings together specialist journalists and foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week has delivered a powerful reminder that although we can communicate at lightning speed across the world, depending on where we are, we can see the same set of events very differently. To demilitarise your neighbour, you invade it. To denazify it, you do what no European leader has done since Hitler sent troops into neighbouring countries to protect ethnic Germans and then wipe those nations from the map. And to defend European security, you watch from the sidelines as Europe's second largest nation is invaded by the largest. Joining us this week, Agnès Poirier, who explains the UK to readers of the French weekly L'Express, Pavel Bandakov, senior editor with the BBC Russian service, and Justin Rolat, who is the BBC's environment correspondent, is here in the studio. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being with us. Pavel Bandakov, can I start with you first? What is Vladimir Putin's conception of historic Russia, and to what extent do you think this has driven the actions he's contemplated and taken?
Hello. The concept of a historic Russia made by Vladimir Putin as a pretext to launch this demilitarization operation is quite a new thing, apparently, because it started last year from the article he published on his website, the official website of the Kremlin, in which he addressed the idea that Ukraine is in fact not a real state, basically, that it's a project he called anti-Russia, and he tried to make the case that, in fact, Ukraine and Russia was always one nation separated by some strange and peculiar twists in history, and that it's historically bound together, and so on and so forth. This concept is, we tried to address it and to run it by these historians, and it has lots of flaws and twists, and all in all, it's quite a mixture of various historical concepts and ideas. But basically, he says that Ukraine been created by communists. And in his speech before the launch of the attack, he said that Ukraine is the country which should be named after Vladimir Lenin. All in all, it's a very strange and very peculiar mixture of various ideas, which does not really fit the idea that Putin is up to some sort of a great Russia recreation of the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. In essence, it might be so, but all in all, it's just his probably personal attitude towards Ukraine as the nation and the Russian neighbor.
That might potentially create some kind of diplomatic opening, Anya. Certainly at the beginning of the week, the Elysee Palace seemed hopeful that it could kind of engineer some kind of Biden-Putin summit. Later in the week, President Macron was talking about being duped. Is there a sense in which his kind of quite friendly approach to President Putin, it's all very well to criticise it once the invasion had happened, but it might have been almost a rational response from a European leader to the inability of Europe to actually be able to stay his hand? All it could do was try to delay it.
Well, what President Macron did was, agreed by all the allies and the partners he was talking to at length and for hours before he actually went to his first trip to Moscow. If you remember, on that long, they were seated on that very, very long table. And weeks before, remember the beginning of the crisis, when only Joe Biden was talking to Vladimir Putin, and although Ukraine is in Europe, Europe was, nowhere to be heard. And France, presiding over the Council of the European Union, did what it had to do, and Emmanuel Macron wanted to give a voice to Europe, and indeed he did. And he likes taking personal risks. I mean, it was highly probable that diplomacy would not give anything. But he tried. He tried until, as far as he could. Because as long as you talk, as long as, the first missile is not sent, there's always a hope for peace. But obviously, from the moment the tanks and Russian army entered Ukraine, diplomacy was not on the table anymore, and the war is here, as Emmanuel Macron said, and he also added, "We are ready." So we'll see that.
War is here, we are ready. President Zelensky of Ukraine was saying at the end of the week, we are alone. And Ukraine, you've visited, you've reported there as a journalist. Give us some sense for people who don't know the country, what it's like, and what that idea of a country alone when it is such an enormous country, how profound that is.
It is absolutely huge. I mean, I think it's 600,000 square kilometres, and the UK is slightly shy of 200,000 square kilometres. So it's a very, very big country in the centre of Europe. It's Europe's breadbasket. I think 10%, maybe slightly more than 10% of Europe's wheat comes from Ukraine. This is a massive country. I mean, when I went, it was in the beginning of its emergence as the president. When I first went, Yanukovych was an ally of Russia. He was subsequently toppled in the kind of People's Rebellion back in 2014. I actually fell foul of Yanukovych. He was upset. I was dressed very much like this, and he actually made a formal complaint to the BBC about my attire. I felt I hadn't been sufficiently respectful. Anyway, he ended up being ejected by the people of Ukraine. So that was really the moment of the emergence of a kind of not an independent Ukraine. It existed as an independent country, but this was the Ukraine expressing its independence from Russia, and this was, of course, the source of much of the difficulties that have followed the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So, yeah, fiercely independent. I mean, a country that I felt when I went, obviously it's very hard to judge, that had a very strong sense of identity. I also had a very interesting meeting this week. I'd like to just mention in passing with Lord Brown, who used to run BP, and negotiated face to face with Putin over a number of meetings. Went to his dacha, met his black Labrador as part of the kind of overtures for a huge deal that BP did with a couple of Russian companies, $13.5 billion deal for oil. He said his experience of Putin was a man who was incredibly bureaucratic, kind of born out of the kind of bureaucratic society of the Soviet Union, who would consider things very carefully, would plan ahead. He said that he didn't think there was any chance that he had planned to invade Ukraine. This was the destination, whatever he was saying to Macron or anyone else. It was almost certain that this was a plan that was on rails, and he was determined to deliver it. So this was the outcome we were going to get, whatever the rest of Europe or indeed the world said to Vladimir Putin.
And that's really interesting. When I was talking to Adam Smith, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, at the beginning of the week in the US Congress, who was basically saying, Pavel, that really there is not much Western countries, including Washington, could do in practical terms, except trying to delay whatever it was that President Putin was going to do. I suppose the question is whether Russian public opinion over a longer term period will see this as an advantageous thing, given what you've said about the kind of perhaps rather weak historic argument on which he's justified it.
Public opinion in Russia is an interesting thing at the moment, because we cannot see, and no one saw yet what is the real attitude and the real numbers of what Russians are thinking about the current crisis. But certainly there is some confusion in there. And if we would compare these events with annexation of Crimea, it's totally different. Because, yes, we saw back in 2014, when Crimea was annexed by Russia, we saw that most of Russians cheered this, and they were really happy, and the support for Vladimir Putin went through the roof, because Crimea was perceived as something, as a symbol of Russian revival. Whereas now it's more like confusion, and it's really it's not understandable what's going on, because it's a full-scale war, which the consequences of this would would be heard and felt throughout Russia as well as throughout Ukraine. And that is why it's quite difficult to estimate the real support of the population to what's going on.
We have a situation where sanctions is the weapon of choice, Agnes, for the West. You've alluded to this already in the efforts that are ongoing. We've had, by the end of the week, we'd had 2 sets of sanctions already being posed on Russia. Some argument over some of the detail is still ongoing. But in terms of the hoped for impact, the question, I suppose, is not just the impact on Russia, which perhaps Pavel could talk about in a moment, but the impact on Western European economies, on the Americans, on the other NATO countries that are signing up to these sanctions. From a European perspective, what are the implications of going down this route?
Well, they are very important. It's not just a question of agreeing on a package and then we all go back to our respective capital and go back to our daily lives and just pray that Ukraine, fights on the behalf of Europe. No, it will have massive and long-term implications, because if the EU is actually the biggest commercial partner of Russia, we also know that in terms of energy, which we'll be talking about a bit later, Europe is incredibly dependent on Russian gas and oil, for instance. And sanctions, which the EU will need to actually notch up, I think, as the Kyiv and other big cities are under siege, and the pressure will be higher for the EU to actually take harsher and harsher sanctions. We've seen, for instance, that what is being discussed is cutting off Russia from SWIFT, but also freezing personal assets of Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov. It's all being talked about. You have European countries who want to have an incremental plan of sanctions, to do it gradually. Others want to strike as quickly, as harsh as possible. But it's a sort of mental shift. It's almost a paradigm shift, because it's a long-term process. It's here to stay, and sanctions will have an effect across all policy areas of the European Union. We have entered a sort of permanent age of crisis, and it will, in many cases, aggravate challenges that we already face in Europe. Also, it means that public opinion in Europe, which might want their government to decide on very harsh sanctions against Russia, will also need to accept that it has a cost. Of course, it's not a high price to pay if you consider that Ukrainians are going to pay with their lives, whereas in Europe, we're just going to pay with euros.
Well, I mean, just on this, I've got a Ukrainian friend who lives in Kyiv, and she said, look, what do these sanctions do? How are they going to stop bombs? How are they going to stop missiles?
Well, they're not.
She's absolutely, yeah. Well, not only that, and she makes the point, look, you're not even taking the really serious sanctions that we could take against Russia, which would be to stop buying its main export, which is its energy. We could stop buying gas and we could stop buying oil from Russia. In theory. I mean, the problem is, and this is the real riddle for Europe, is that it can't actually do that because we are so dependent on Russian.
And even in
supply.
UK, we don't have much gas storage, do we? So we can't look for other sources longer term. We're kind of still beholden to this.
We are, and we're a couple of weeks. I mean, we aren't immediately dependent on the Russians, and we do get our gas from elsewhere here in the UK. But absolutely, I mean, these supplies do. We need constant supplies of these things. And in fact, it's interesting.
And if the price keeps ratcheting
there
up,
hasn't even been a discussion about should we be imposing sanctions on oil and gas. So that just tells us how challenging this is. And I mean, on that, and picking up on the point that Agnes makes, look at the impact that this has had on fuel prices. I mean, across Europe, people are feeling the effects across Europe, across the world. We're seeing some of the highest petrol prices that we've ever seen in the UK. Gas prices are spiking. I mean, extraordinary increase in gas. I mean, let me just give you the figures because they are so striking. A year ago in the UK, we were paying 40 pence a therm. That's about 50 US cents a therm. Now we're paying £2.75. That's $3.70 a therm. What an increase. And it's creating a huge political crisis here in Britain because the cost of living is rising so dramatically.
And even in Washington, of course, Joe Biden is under a lot of pressure over gas prices, over the price people pay on the forecourts at their gas stations. What in the UK we would call petrol, but throughout historically petrol and diesel and the other fuels, they refer to as gas. But the whole point is that money problem is an international problem now, isn't it? And anything of this kind that affects a big supplier of energy is going to have an impact. So much for climate change arguments. We might touch on that again in a moment when we talk about environment. I want to, as you are the BBC's environment correspondent, Justin, at least we can
BBC's climate editor.
Climate editor, forgive me. Just in terms of that, in practical terms, Pavel, what about the impact on the Russian economy here? Because the point is, we are told, is that Russia has built up these enormous reserves, $620 billion worth of reserves. It's got its debt levels down, but a quarter of its exports are bought by Europeans. I mean, China presumably can only step in so far, even if it's minded to help fill some of that gap.
Oh, well, it's interesting example was what happened back in 2014 when Europe imposed the first round of sanctions following Crimea. One of the retaliation measures which Russia undertook back then was banning the import of certain products from the European Union. And that was things like cheese and, chocolate and other things. For instance, you still cannot buy Italian Parmesan or Spanish jamon in Russia. And that was, of course, that had some sort of effect on the European farmers, but it had even bigger effect on the Russian consumers. It's always strange to assess the real impact of sanctions on the policies in Russia, on the regime, because the population is not that affected with certain measures we saw before, but they could be more affected with countermeasures the Russian government is trying to undertake. What we saw so far, let's say the collapse of air traffic between Russia and European countries, between Russia and Britain, that's happened already. So there are no direct flights, and there will be no direct flights in months to come. This certainly that has a detrimental effect on the certain parts of the Russian society, but not for economy in general. And the rest would be up until, as you mentioned, certain sectors would be targeted. It would be fine probably for the government to sustain its spending with current reserves. But as we can see, it looks like Europe and the US and other governments are trying to step up. And even now we are in the middle of discussions, and we can hear those discussions that it's not enough, and probably we should target the financial markets more, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And of course, Russia has China, but it's really difficult to divert to the whole trade towards China and substitute the European trade agreements.
In truth, presumably, Agnes, there's a kind of twin strategy here, isn't there? Sanctions which in part are aimed at the people around Putin, the people who do travel, the people who have some wealth abroad, the people who've bought houses in London or have holiday homes in Bulgaria or wherever it may be. But that simultaneously that the Ukrainians, I've heard it referred to by people in Washington as the porcupine strategy, that Ukrainians themselves will kind of make it so difficult for Russia to sustain, at the very least, any kind of change of regime or any kind of potentially occupation of even parts of the bit that they've crossed over into, that could be, the two together could force a rethink of Vladimir Putin's approach?
Well, I mean, it's very hard for us because, for us in Europe, because this is a European war taking place, 2 hours from London by plane. And we know we're not going to be fighting alongside Ukrainians. We know that. We know we can only do sanctions. However, we can do a lot, but they are not going to have overnight effects. And, the state of disbelief that you see in Ukraine, but also in Europe, where we don't have, it's going to take time for us to understand and to realize that we've now entered a new phase in European history.
And this is quite a profound challenge, isn't it? Because the whole basis of the NATO alliance wasn't just we defend each other from attack, potentially from the then Warsaw Pact, but that actually there was a concept of Europe that kind of stretched beyond simply the membership of NATO. I mean, that's quite a challenge, isn't it? We're saying we can't fight for this country. The NATO countries are saying that, the Western capitals are saying that. But in a sense, what is it for? I mean, Macron talked a couple of years ago, I think, about it being brain dead as a concept. I mean, isn't there a danger that that's how it looks after an event of this kind?
Well, on one hand, you could say that the irony, of course, is suddenly Braindead NATO is being resurrected, and it's triggered Article 4 on Friday, and it needs to actually show that it's here for a reason. But we've been talking about how international institutions such as the UN, for instance, or NATO, were not fit for the 21st century. And when President Macron talked about brain-dead NATO, he meant actually that we can't, when I say we, I'm talking about Europe, and Europeans, we can always rely on America to protect us and to be responsible for our security. And especially in time of Donald Trump in Washington. And, it's very interesting what President Macron said in the early hours after the European Council on Friday morning. He said the European Union is not just a market of consumers. We now need to be a power and to project power. And we need to accelerate our agenda of sovereignty. That's his words. But he's been talking about it for a long time. That's his main idea about Europe, that we must become independent, or certainly more independent military. And it's very interesting because the thinking in military circles in France, but also in Europe, in the last few years is that, 30 years ago, European armies were taking part in peacekeeping missions. Then in the last 10 years, the French army took part in counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism operations, for instance, in Africa. But the thinking now is that, we need to change scale, to reform, to invest, to modernize our army, and to toughen our training for what they call high-end war. You can also call it state-on-state conflict.
Pavel, this has been an opportunity that President Putin has seized, but things could change rapidly, could they, from a Russian perspective?
Yes, and as we saw, NATO is the key factor in his reasoning presented before launching this operation in Ukraine. Russia of Vladimir Putin saw NATO as a threat for quite some time, and enlargement of NATO, inclusion of Eastern European countries within NATO, seen as as a direct threat, probably less so militarily, but clearly ideologically. And in this respect, I tend to agree that several years ago NATO might been brain dead or irrelevant on so many aspects of
Pavel?
politics, but this time it looks like NATO as even in ideological terms, if Putin repeats it, NATO seems relevant because at least this is how it's seen, and it has to be reformed probably.
It's a very good point to end on, this kind of potential revival, but perhaps for all the wrong reasons. Pavel Banderklov of the BBC Russian Service and the Sporia and Express and the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rellett, thank you all very much. Thank you. That's all from Dateline London. Goodbye.